Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to Reset Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in Political Science, we will be starting with Indian political thought, and today we will have an overview of Indian political thought. To discuss this topic, we have with us our subject expert Dr. Himanshu Roy. Dr. Roy is Associate Professor in Department of Political Science in Deen Dayal Upadhyay College, University of Delhi. Without further ado, I would like to welcome sir to our studios and request him to start the lecture. Welcome sir.
Thank you, Amrit. Today we'll begin with the Indian political thought. It broadly has three sections. One pre-Kautilyan, in which we'll take up this Rigved, then Ramayana, Mahabharata, which is treated as mythologies. Then from Buddha time, Digha Nikaya's time, we'll come to modern democratic period, that is around 1857-61 period, when in installments gradually the democracy begins, and afterward subsequently. So these three sections from Kautil to 1857, pre-Kautil, and then after 1857. So let's begin with the idea of political. What is Indian political thought? What is distinctive about Indian political thought, or what is political thought? Basically, what we think about states, its policies, social movements, then the nature of the state, sovereignty, monarchy, different features, we understand it as the Indian political thought. Indian because there are certain very specific features about the Indian, the character called Indian. Number one, we had longer time of hereditary monarchy in India. From Buddha onwards, we have hereditary monarchy in India, and then we had not such kind of theocratic states as it was in Europe. The secondly, or thirdly, that there was no conflict with church or pope for sovereignty. The monarchs here were absolute. Such kinds of Indianness, or that is distinctiveness, we do not find in European traditions. So let me begin with the idea of political in India in pre-Kautilyan time. It begins with the 9th and 10th Mandalam, that is chapter of Rigved, in which for the first time, as per the Hindu polity of K.P. Jaiswal, their interpretations, or Father Kamil Bulske's Ram Katha, where he mentions, we find the state in a very nebulous form emerging for the first time. So from here we take it as the beginning of the political element in Indian political thought, or the emergence of a state. It has been argued that Rigved is a mythology because we do not find any material evidence for it as we have after Buddha. But nevertheless, we will come to it. The three texts that we will be discussing today, that is Ramayana, Mahabharata, and of course, as I said earlier, Rigved, are considered as mythologies. But from where or when this mythologies was written? One of the arguments, for example, of Ambedkar was that it was written after Buddha or during Buddha period. The reason being that there was no lipi, that is a script. The first script that we found in India is Brahmi lipi, Brahmi script. Earlier, then in what form it would have been written? For example, in order to make the things clear, the contemporary tribal societies, they have their mythologies, but they don't have the language, they have the dialects. Whereas pre-Buddhist, it is theoretically possible to have language. Sanskrit was a language, but in absence of the script, it was not written. So Rigveda was not written. But we have the traditions of Smriti and Shruti, and for which generations were trained to pass on these legacies from one generation to another. Of course, there were interpolations, because the argument is that from the second mandalam, that is from the second chapter to mandalam 8, it is a cohesive kinds of stanzas, sloks, written over a particular period when there was no class formation as such, there was no gap between the rich and the poor, there was no state as such, and therefore no political element we find in the Rigveda. It was a bliss. It was a sort of pastoral economy that could be left to imaginations, but different imaginations. But for a social scientist to analyze, we find that the idea reflects the kind of society by and large, and the second to eighth chapter reflects a kind of a bliss in the society where there is no poverty, there is no alienation, there is no discrimination, there is no untouchability, there are no castes, there are no state, and therefore no political element is there. Then, as per Patanjali Mahabhas, there are 21 Rigveda. This is very remarkable. 21 Rigveda, different kind of texts maybe. Because as the society moved, as the society migrated, people carried their legacies to different locations. Tribal societies move. It's not, any society is not a fixed frozen society. If that is the case, then in course of time, it perishes, the civilization perishes. So in order to survive, as we expand, as we get enriched, we move. There is a mobility, there is a migration. And with this migration, their cultural legacies, their academic pursuits, their knowledge of the nature and the society with the public intellectuals, with the academics of the time, the rishis, that might have migrated from one place to another. So therefore, Patanjali notes in his Mahabhas that there are 21 kind of Rigvedas. During Dara Sikho's time, which is around Aurangzeb's time, Dara Sikho was brother of Aurangzeb, 5 Rigvedas survived, or the traditions of 5 Rigvedas survived. This is another very remarkable thing in Indian history. Out of this 5, we have the text of the 2 still. And only 1 out of the 2 can recite in Rigvedic traditions their own text. And the Sanskrit in the Rigvedic tradition is entirely different the way it is spoken, the Sanskrit that is spoken today. Because as the society moves with the time, the language changes. Because language itself reflects the entire society, their thinking and the feelings. For example, in order to make the things clear, earlier, 50 years ago, in the villages, we used to call a word called Shukul. Shukul is a surname. Now we call it Shukla. The word has become more anglicized. So with the change of the time and the society, and with the passage of the time and history, we find the language changing, the pronunciation of the words changing. So the Rigveda changed, more texts, samhitas arrived and survived with the passage of time. So in our times, only 5 Rigveda survives, and we have the manuscripts of the 2. There are different stanzas, richaye, in all the different surviving 5 Rigvedic texts. Secondly, the importance, the priority of the stanzas or the richayas are different. So this is one aspect that we find in the Rig Veda. But from the chapter 9th and 10th, we find for the first time the political element emerging, and that is reflection of the state. The Sabha, the Samiti, the Prajapati, the Rajan. These are some of the words reflects the concepts or the institutions. And gradually the specialization or the specialized role of the state developing over the centuries. Partly it is reflected in Digh Nikaya, which was written roughly 7500 years after the death of Buddha. We will come to it subsequently, but let me complete this part in the pre-Kautilyan era about the Indian political thought, or the political in the Indian political thought in the pre-Kautilyan era. Centuries later, we do not know, we don't have actual detail or the facts that when Rig Veda was written, who was the rishi who had written it, any one man or a group of men. The consensus says that it was a group of rishis, academicians of the time, the philosophers of that time, who had written these 7 chapters or 8 chapters of the Rig Veda. Subsequently, there are interpolations because chapter 1 and chapter 9 or 10 are considered as interpolations. There is a consensus that these were subsequently added. And therefore, since there is no material evidences that when it was written, it is considered still as a part of mythology. The second is we find centuries later. How many centuries later we do not know. We do not have material evidence. There are speculations. Of course, Egyptology, the kind of software that we have developed in America, in Europe or in India, measuring through the constellation of stars, etc., and the natural forces, 5,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago are the estimate when Ramayana was being written. When Rig Veda was being written, we do not have even that concrete evidence, the material facts. But in Ramayana, if you go through the literature, in Ramayana we find concrete evidences of the formation of a state. The state is more starkly visible. And secondly, with certain characteristics, 4 or 5 characteristics, so we call it organs of a state. For example, the king or the minister, council of ministers, these or the even army, these are emerging in Ramayana. Secondly, one important thing that has emerged in comparison to Rig Veda, that in Ramayana we find hereditary monarchy emerging, which was not visible in Rig Veda. In Rig Veda we find highly democratic, elected, consensual, and commonly, even in the last 9th and 10th chapters where we find the state emerging, the political emerging, it's highly democratic. But in Ramayana, we find a hereditary monarchy. Of course, directly or indirectly, the consent was taken from the council of ministers or advisors or sage elderly persons for the next successor. For example, Dasrath nominating his eldest son, Ram, for the kingship. As for the mythological text, Ramayana, I am not talking about the Ramcharitmanas. I am talking about Valmiki Ramayana. And the council of ministers giving consent. But a son, the eldest son, inheriting the monarchy. This has come to be an established practice in India, which is visible for the first time so starkly. So, in centuries that evolved after Rig Veda, and we do not know how many centuries passed by, that this hereditary monarchy emerges. Till this time, or subsequently till Mahabharata time, we find the eldest son inheriting the monarchy. That we call it law of primogeniture, which means the eldest son will inherit. There were different reasons behind it. In order to check the fragmentation of the taxation, because the estate is based on the taxation system, it cannot survive. It is based on either the regular army or some people's militia. Some kind of expenses have to be borne. If the people do not contribute voluntarily, then they have to be forced to contribute. And once the citizens or the subjects are forced to contribute, that becomes the part of the taxation. And then there are different rules, either customary practices, which are the rules of those times in the past, or some written rules through which it is enforced that a family or a person is bound to pay different kinds of taxes. So, in order to run a state, there has to be a taxation. That is reflected by or reflected in Dignikaya in post-Buddha time, where it has been argued that how the estate emerges. There is a greed all across in the society, there is a theft, there is a violence, and in order to check it, the people consented to create a Rajan. And 1/6 of the rice or the paddy will be donated and contributed by each family for this Rajan, who will supervise, who will look after the law and order problem or the contradictions and the crisis in the society. So, it is the sign of the emergence of monarchy. I will come to it slightly later on, but in order to make the point clear, I gave this example that in Dignikaya, we find this kind of contractual. Contractual means the people coming to an agreement to create a Rajan, to look after them, and he taking it up as a professional job, and in return he is getting contributions in terms of tax from the subjects and the city or the citizens. In Ramayana, we find, since hereditary monarchy has emerged as it is reflected in the text, in the literature, so there is a system of taxation. It has been argued that this was voluntary. It may be voluntary, but taxation and the maintenance of the estate to a certain extent or beyond a point in history becomes coercive. It is forced, or the amount is fixed, whether you agree or you do not agree. It depends on the whims and fancies of the rulers to negotiate that how much tax you will be able to pay. And then, of course, the role of the coercive apparatus of the state, the police, the army, and the entire command and chain of bureaucracy, which is meant to collect the tax. So, an organization emerges above the society, which is not part of the society. Of course, it emerged with the consent of the society, but it acquires an autonomous shape which rules over the society. Still, in those years when Ramayana was there, it was still considered as an ideal state, an early state, an ideal state, where the force is not there, where the things are still voluntary. Then we find the third mythology, that is Mahabharata. In Mahabharata, a state becomes more stark, more visible, more number of features emerging, and there is a conflict among the different brothers for the throne. So the kingship is contested. By kingship means who will become the king, the elder brother or the eldest brother, of which family. So the conflict between the brothers in a family for the kingdom, that is visible first time in Mahabharata. In Ramayana, there is a very muted, subtle challenge at the level of the idea. For example, Bharat's mother tried to foist Bharat as the monarch after Dasarath, not Ram. So the kingship or crowning of Ram was being contested. But of course, Bharat himself withdrew as per the mythological text, if it is called mythological. Here we find in Mahabharata there is a violent contest, and the one faction is not willing to compromise, not willing to withdraw. And finally we find that there is a war, there are battles which continues for 18 days, and finally Yudhishthir wins, being the eldest, but he wins through a very violent war. So we find that in pre-Kautilyan time, through these three texts, which are considered as mythological texts because their timing is not fixed, there is no material evidences, what are the gaps between these three texts, therefore mythological. But still I will vouch for that sometimes in the history, they are all these three texts are not mere figment of imaginations. They must have been rooted sometimes in the history. And the kind of text and the languages, it reflects probably a pre-Buddhan society, a pre-Buddha society. Of course, the first time the Lipi was developed after Buddha, and what we understand as Brahmi Lipi, or the script. It is therefore very contentious point. Now let me come to Digha Nikaya, and we will conclude with this section with Digha Nikaya. We have a written text, a document after the death of Buddha, because during the Buddha days we had already seen the hierarchical or hereditary monarchies and hierarchical society, a hierarchical state. So hereditary monarchy, a developed state was already in existence. In Ramayana, in Mahabharata, and in Rigveda, we find the state emerging and developing with not all the characteristics that we find in ancient India in the most classic way in Kautilyan state. In Digha Nikaya, we find a crystal clear case where the state is emerging and how it is emerging. It is the necessity of the society because of the development of the greed, the kind of greed that had emerged, which means in indirect way the emergence of private property. In derivative discourse then, it means the formation of rich and poor, the social division. Structurally, a society is getting divided into rich and poor. And definitely, some resources or some people are getting concentrated into few hands. and therefore all this kind of violence and the need for the emergence of a state. So by the time Digha Nikaya comes or is being written in post-Buddha time, the state had by and large acquired its full-blown form, which is being now subsequently 200 years later written in a classic treatise, we call it Arthashastra, written by Kautil. And we find here in his writing that all the 7 organs of the state with its foreign policy and every department's work in a very detailed form has been written. How the state should conduct, where the fort should be located, how it should be surrounded. So the safety features of the state, the safety features of the subjects, and mind it, now with the hereditary monarchy developing, the people no longer remains the citizens, because the voluntary democratic process comes to an end. Monarchy means, when the hereditary practices are there, it means the citizenship has been relegated into the background. The democratic principles, the universal franchise, that has been relegated into the background. And we find, as a result of this, consequences of this, the free independent institutions working for the society by and large ceases to exist logically. It doesn't mean that there is no freedom, there is no autonomy. In fact, if Indian society is compared with the European society, Indian society has always been far more enjoyed degree of freedom despite being a long hereditary monarchy. And therefore, because of this freedom, we find the state and the people having so much of tenacity to fight back, not violently, but in different forms of protest, that they enjoyed the degree of freedom and there was no theocratic state. So in Indian history, we find almost in such a long span and in such a geographical vast territory, absence of a theocratical state and an episcopal order, the kind of church that Europe had. We don't had such kind of episcopal order, such kind of any religious organizations. So the degree of freedom for each subject even under the hereditary monarchy was far, far better than any, even the very limited citizenship that the Greco-Roman civilizations that enjoyed in the ancient Greek or Roman society. So the democracy in Greek and Roman society had, of course, a longer tenure. Early arrival in modern times, sustained for itself in longer time in Greco-Roman civilizations, had a shorter hereditary history of monarch, but in terms of individual freedom, we find that Indian society had a far much degree of freedom. So here we'll conclude with 3 main points that I will be repeating. We had a longer hereditary monarchy. Number 2, yet we had a far larger degree of individual freedom. And 3, that the idea of political thought we find existing even in the pre-Buddha period, starting from Rig Veda 9th and 10th chapter. Thank you very much. In the second section, we will begin focusing on the main characteristics of the state. Some of these characteristics that we find, and particularly if you make a comparison with Europe, then that will be better to understand. Is, for example, let's begin with sovereignty of the state in India. Has it ever been challenged? As it has been challenged time and again in Europe. There has been dual sovereignty or the contest for sovereignty. Sovereignty means supremacy of the state. Who will be the superior, the monarch or the pope? For example, in Europe that has been going on. In India, we had no such contest for the supremacy. Monarch had absolute reign. Then we had a developed army. And the army always remained under the command and control of the monarch. Then the property relations and the idea of the ideal polity. What could be the ideal polity? What could be the ideal monarchy? Do we had the civil society? All these aspects, these features will be discussing in this section. Now let me begin with, as I had said in the previous section, that the degree of freedom that we Indians had, even in the pre-colonial society and even in the colonial times, that degree of freedom was not existing in the European society. An ordinary serf in the European society, an ordinary subject, was forced to go to church. We were never forced to do this. By and large, there were forced conversion. There is no doubt about it. But in terms of the percentage of the total population, it was peanuts. Yes, there was a forced conversion. We simply cannot ignore it. But as I said, that in terms of total population, and I am repeating here, it was peanuts. It was very insignificant population. And that too, say in the pre-colonial society. Even in the colonial society, the conversion to Christianity, for example, was insignificant. It means there was something very strong, something very strong in terms of the belief and values and the culture of Indian society. And one of the reasons was the freedom to pursue its own path, not in terms of only religiosity or religion, but in every aspect. And the simple reason for it was the ordinary people, roughly 75% of the populations, broadly characterized as OBC now, other backward castes or classes, including even Dalits, who had 15% population as per the contemporary standard, or 7% tribal population. So the vast majority of the people of different castes, or which were basically different professions, which had become hereditary in course of time. At least from Buddha time we find we have material evidence. So for almost 2700 years, or approximately for 3000 years, we find the castes existing which were professional or hereditary professions. So we find that these professional groups, these castes, despite being hereditary, had a substantive amount of freedom in contradistinction to the slave society that Greco-Roman civilizations had, and the serf society that the medieval Europe had. In contemporary political debates, because of the electoral politics or because of the distorted understanding in academia, it is considered something very progressive to give a sweeping judgment that we had also a slave society, we had also some bandhua mazdoor, some kind of serfdom here. But a comparison point by point with the European society gives us a clear, distinct picture that here the degree of freedom in the civil society was far different. Let me make my point clear. In Maharashtra, for example, from 11th, 12th century, we had the female Dalit saint poets. This reflects the degree of freedom that any society, particularly regions, even include if we focus on a particular region, the degree of freedom that enjoyed, that a Dalit females became the saint poetess, or even such a radical intellect like Kabir in the medieval time, during Sikandar Lodi's time. We rarely find such kind of radical intellect mind, a public intellectual or organic intellectual, an orphan, a labor basically, a weaver, sold his products and thinking about Begumpura, an ideal polity, an ideal village polity where there is no taxation, there is no estate. It reflects the kind of freedom and the way he was critical of the revenue administration or the judicial administration of his time. Imagine a feudal society and a religious center in Banaras, and a saint poet speaking against this kind of oppression. It reflects the degree of freedom that Indians enjoyed even in the pre-modern democracies, despite being hereditary monarchies. That reflects the kind of civil society, that is the freedom a person enjoyed. Now let me come to the debate or differences between the Dalit and the slaves. Slaves, each member was purchased and sold. There was nothing like family or private property. There were different kind of slaves. We had slavery in India, but in terms of total population or the percentage of their population, in comparison to the total population of India, it was insignificant. Hardly 1 to 2%, not more than 5% in any case. That too in the medieval period, during the Delhi Sultanate period, or in ancient India, during Chanakya Kautil's time. But here, even the Dalit had their, and wide, let me state here or remind here that there were very wide variations all across different regions of India. There is nothing like uniformity or commonality, of course, except for some common elements like Sanskrit was one, for example, or the caste, the professional groups. There are commonalities, there is no doubt about it, but in pre-capitalist economy, in pre-colonial economy, the diversities was much more. And the Dalits had their houses, had their married life, had their kids. Unlike Western slaves, they were not purchased and sold. They owned land, partly of course, with different regional variations. Of course, they were the poorer section of the society. And of course, a degree of untouchability varying in different regions were there, of which the best expression or the best reflection was given by Dr. Ambedkar. But this kind of freedom is one aspect which makes Indian society and its reflection in Indian political thought very distinctive. This also reflects that customarily we had the private property. There was a very strong misnomer during the colonial times that Indians had no private properties. Theoretically, scripturally, it might be sound or it might have been written that every land is owned by Gopal or the god or the monarch. But we know that in practice, customarily, the peasants had their land holdings and it was their customary right to cultivate. So the ownership of cultivable lands in most parts of India, even in the pre-colonial, pre-capitalist economy, had the private property. There was a sense of justice. There was a delivery mechanism. So we find, in comparison to West, and I am deliberately making a comparison with the West to make the features of Indian political thought more sharp and distinct. Simply because the reason that it has been argued and the legacy persists that Indian political thought did not exist. There was nothing like Indian political thought. So in order to reinforce the point that long back the European civilizations had their political thought, we in India had our own political thought. And therefore, the focus, as I began in the first section with the Rig Veda. Now the freedom of criticism. And of course, Kabir is the best. Another in South, for example, we see Tiruvalluvar in ancient. In 12th, 11th century, we find Vasbanna. Then in the Andhra Pradesh, we find Vemana. And in modern times, in Kerala, we find who was contemporary of Tilak, Narayan Guru. The purpose to cite these names is to state another distinctive feature of Indian political thought or Indianness into it is that we change without coming into conflict with the larger parts in the society. So we avoid conflict, the class struggle, and without coming into conflict, the violent conflict, we change, and we have been changing. It was very wrong notion on part of Karl Marx, very wrong on part of Karl Marx to say that India has been unchanging. And the poor chap wrote his formulations based on the reports that the colonial administrators sent from India. India has always been changing. And the modernity in India, it's not a one-time concept. Modernity is not colonial. Modernity is not capitalist. Modernity is not only democracy. Modernity in India has been continuing for the time immemorial or since time immemorial. There has always been changes in Indian history. And people, the subjects, have been fighting. Of course, the violent revolutionary transformation overthrowing the state that as we find it in Greco-Roman civilizations, as we find it in modern European civilizations, that kind of violent revolutionary overthrow of the state and society, that radical rupture from the past that we do not find or rarely find in the Indian history. The sheer reason behind it, to my understanding, is the degree of freedom that we as a subjects enjoyed despite being hereditary monarchy, despite being a degree of untouchability. And secondly, the state was not able to force upon the subjects the way it forced upon its European subjects. And thirdly, the changes in India has been gradual, incremental, without much entering into violent conflict. So change, gradual, incremental. This is another feature of Indian political thought. Now we find this kind of hereditary structure of the monarchy witnessing a rapid social change or transformation once colonial power comes to India from 1757 to by 1840s. The traditional political sovereignty of India was defeated and destroyed one by one, not at one go, not wholesale, but in installments, regions by regions, beginning from Bengal in 1757, then Tipu Sultan south in first decade, last decade of 18th century and first decade of, and then Delhi and Punjab. So by 1840s, 44, 45, we find that most parts of India, the traditional sovereignty, the political sovereignty of India was destroyed, defeated. And a new power, a new kind of economic power, a new kind of a state emerges on the ruins of the old. What was new here? The remarkable new was, in installment, the development of modern democratic aspects. The legislative assembly that we used to read, or usually we read in Rigvedic chapters 9 and 10, or even in Dignikaya, that kind of modern legislative assembly emerging at the provincial level, at the federal level, at the municipal corporation levels. And in 1885, we find the modern political party, the Indian National Congress, was formed. And of course, before that, we find series of political associations coming into being. So the modern political freedom is being established. And of course, it was not the British who invited, but it emerged from among the Indians in earlier form, in kind of civic development, in form of civil liberties, modern civil liberties. We find it beginning from 1815, 1817, etc., when the trading rights of the British East India Company was gradually in installments being terminated. So modern democracy is one where we find the development. The second is, and not very much distinct from the past, but in a more nuanced way, refined way, a state is emerging which shall have no religion of its own. Even in British time, or even in pre-British time, we had never such a kind of theocratic state as I had said. But yes, the religion of the rulers during Ashok time, during Mughal periods or Sultanate periods, the religion of the rulers had its impact in the formulation of policies, and that impacted the subjects. Or the religion of the ruling class or the ruling establishments had its impact on the political and practical behavior of the subjects. We find now a state that is emerging has no religion of its own. And whoever comes to occupy the position of the state has its own secular policies by and large that gradually develops after 1863 in the colonial times and subsequently in post 47 period when India becomes independent. Yes, and aberrations emerges, and that too still that is continuing. Minority rights were deliberately created by the colonial state in connivance with the Muslim feudal elite. And that minority rights, India had never such kind of minority rights. In fact, it's the minorities who ruled in this country, the religious minorities who ruled in this country. But a section of the academics we find, or the political theorists, justifying minority rights as Indian variety of secularism or Indian variety of democracy. A counter question can be asked to them. Marx was a Jew, a minority, but Marx never sought minority rights. He always sought universal rights as secular rights. So how come minority rights in India, a creation of colonial state for very definite reasons and vested interest, is part of the modern democracy? It should have been abolished long back. And modern democracy, a modern civil society, has a degree of uniformity in terms of constitutional rights. So if religion is the premise or the basis of religious differences and versions, so tomorrow there may be caste rights. Every caste will be asking for their own rights. So are we moving towards backward or we intend to move forward? So what is the definition of progressive? Moving forward towards more universal common rights, more secular rights, more humane rights, or moving backward in terms of individual freedom premised on religious and caste rights. This is one contentious debate that is haunting the Indian society post 47, which should have been long abolished in the Constituent Assembly debates itself. Of course, separate electorate was abolished. But other things continued simply because of the apprehensions. The other important part of the Indian political thought is that our position in the Committee of Nations, our international relations. We in India, even in the past, have rarely expanded. The idea has been to protect the Indian state over the centuries rather than to expand the Indian state occupying the other territories. So the centrality, the center of the argument has been safety of the Indian state, the protection of the Indian state. And this psyche, this trend continues even in modern Indian democracy. So we find that this trend of our relations with the other states is based on a more democratic, more consensual, and more safety feature, safety for itself, taking into account the interest of the Indian society and of course the Indian ruling establishments, including the contemporary business. So in the coming years, as the emerging trend reflects in the cosmopolitan global world, when we have been in the past, where for centuries the people have been coming from outside and we have been accommodating them and adapting with them, the Indian society shall not have the trouble to accommodate with the global world that we are having now. So let me summarize the second section with the characteristics of modern democracy emerging, then, and of course hereditary monarchy being abolished after 1857, 1858, then the globalization and the thinking that we had already in the past, the impact of the migrations and their thinking that impacted us, this continues. We are accommodating and adapting to the new circumstances. So Indian politics, with a degree of freedom that we enjoyed in the past and the kind of mindset that we had, adaptive, accommodative, even in the contemporary globalized world, it will and it should continues to progress, taking into account the entire humanity. Thank you very much.
Dear friends, due to paucity of time, we have to stop our lecture here. On that note, we would like to thank Dr. Roy for coming to our show and delivering this wonderful lecture. And thank you, dear friends, for watching our lecture. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.